my name is Lauren, and I live in a small suburb of Seattle, which has always seemed cozy and safe to me. I married Andrew when I was 24, and we immediately began building our life together. Andrew is a high-ranking engineer, a calm and serious person. He always seemed reliable and stable, exactly the kind of person I could spend my whole life with. Our relationship was steady, but not like the ones in movies about great love. This wasn't a problem for me at first. I thought stability and mutual understanding were more important than passionate emotions. We bought a small house, had cozy evenings, and slowly settled in. I worked at the local library, enjoying the peace and quiet of this life. But soon after the wedding, the first difficulties began. It wasn't something obvious that could be easily named a problem. Rather, it was like small cracks on glass that deepened over time. Andrew was attentive, but seemed emotionally distant. In intimate moments, he was often awkward, quickly tired, and soon our nights became rare and tense. I tried not to pay much attention to it, but each failed attempt made us drift further apart. I felt he was avoiding intimacy, and this began to worry me more than I was willing to admit. Over time, this problem stopped being just a matter of discomfort. We couldn't conceive, and each new cycle only increased the internal tension. Andrew seemed unwilling to acknowledge that something was wrong. He avoided conversations about doctors, tests, or medical solutions. I saw that this topic was painful for him, but the silence in our home became increasingly oppressive. When our attempts to have a child failed for almost 2 years, I began to feel an invisible but increasingly tangible pressure from Andrew's family. His parents, especially his mother, seemed kind and caring at first glance, but every time she mentioned children, it was like a light stab in my soul. She could do it casually, as if in passing, at a family dinner when we were all sitting together. I think the house will be even cozier when little feet appear, right? I knew that for Andrew, these words were painful, but for me, they became a daily reminder of our failure. I felt more and more guilt and helplessness. Every time I met my mother-in-law, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at me not only with care, but also with a slight doubt, as if wondering what the reason for our failures was. This feeling became especially apparent when she cautiously, with a gentle smile, said to me alone, "Have you thought about consulting a doctor? Sometimes that's all you need." And although her words were said with good intentions, they hit the mark. Andrew couldn't stand such conversations. He categorically refused to discuss any medical tests or visits to doctors. When his mother brought up the topic of possible consultations again, I saw his face darken, and he quickly changed the subject. One evening, after another family dinner when his parents hinted at it again, he exploded. He stood up abruptly from the table, angrily saying, "We don't need any tests. Everything is fine." His voice sounded so harsh that the room fell into complete silence. I sat across from him, feeling the tension filling the whole house. I wanted to say something, try to soften his words, but I couldn't find the strength. After that dinner, another crack appeared between Andrew and me. We practically stopped discussing our feelings, and intimate moments became rare and seemed more like an obligation than an expression of love. I understood that for him, this issue had become a painful topic, but ignoring it further was impossible. I noticed that every time I mentioned doctors or tests, he withdrew into himself, becoming distant and cold. There was pain in his eyes that he tried to hide behind stubbornness. Every conversation on this topic ended in silence, and this silence became unbearable. It became increasingly difficult for me to cope with the internal pressure. At times, I felt that an invisible wall had arisen between me and Andrew, which I couldn't break through. He was nearby, but his emotional detachment made him almost a stranger. I caught myself envying couples who had children, feeling like this desire was becoming almost an obsession. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law continued to gently push us towards solving the problem, but each of her suggestions seemed like a reproach to me. One evening was particularly difficult. Andrew's parents invited us to a special dinner organized for their anniversary. Throughout the evening, Andrew's mother casually brought up the topic of how important it is not to waste time if there are problems with conception. Sometimes a couple just needs a little push, she said, looking directly at me. I felt all the gazes in the room turn to me, and my heart tightened with a sense of guilt. Andrew, sitting next to me, clenched his fists the whole time. When his mother suggested we seriously consider medical consultation, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and abruptly left the room, leaving us in silence. His father didn't interfere. He sat, gloomily glancing at us, as if watching the drama unfold before his eyes. My hands trembled under the table. I felt like I was caught between two worlds, the world of my husband, who was avoiding the problem, and the world of his family, who clearly considered me the cause of all our failures. At that moment, I just wanted to disappear. The pressure from all sides was unbearable, and I didn't know where to turn for support. I remember that evening too clearly. It started like many evenings. I returned home from work, tired and wanting nothing more than to spend a quiet evening with Andrew. But he wasn't there. He was late at work, as had become common in recent months. The house seemed eerily quiet. We had just had dinner with his parents, and his mother had gone to her usual yoga classes, leaving me and my father-in-law alone. I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, hoping to have a few minutes alone before heading upstairs to the bedroom. But suddenly, the silence changed. I felt my father-in-law's presence behind me. Suddenly, everything around seemed to slow down. His steps were quiet, but the air was filled with a strange, oppressive tension that made me freeze. Before I could realize what was happening, I felt strong arms wrap around my waist from behind. My body immediately seized with horror, but I couldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed, trying to understand what was happening, but fear gripped me, squeezing my heart with an icy grip. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't even turn around. My hands, which had just been holding a plate, weakened, and it slipped into the sink with a dull sound. Inside me, everything screamed, but my body seemed to refuse to listen. I couldn't even breathe, so strong was the shock. "I'll help you," he whispered in my ear, his breath burning my neck, and those words filled me with waves of horror and disgust. Help? He thought he was doing me a favor? My mind refused to accept his words. I tried to resist, but fear and helplessness enveloped me, not allowing me to even think about how to get out. I tried to scream again, but he immediately put his hand over my mouth and all sound stopped, just like my world at that moment. I closed my eyes, hoping that this was just a nightmare from which I would wake up soon. But it wasn't a dream. His arms became stronger, and I felt him forcing me to do something I couldn't resist. Everything happened so quickly, and all I could do was try to suppress the scream that remained in my throat. My consciousness at that moment seemed to split into two parts. One part screamed with horror, with shame, with pain, the other, as if watching all this from the side, trying to understand how I ended up in this trap. This was not just a physical act. It was an invasion of my very essence, my dignity, my right to be myself. I felt broken and crushed, like a lifeless doll. Every movement of my father-in-law brought me unbearable pain, not so much physical as emotional. I stood as if detached from my body, as if this was happening not to me. But this reality was too real. My head was spinning. Black spots floated before my eyes, and my whole body trembled with fear and hatred for myself for not being able to stop this. I hated myself for my helplessness, for not being able to break free. When it was all over, I felt the world crumble around me. My father-in-law slowly stepped back, as if nothing terrible had happened, and his calmness only intensified my horror. He wiped his hands, as if it was just an ordinary dinner, and said those words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "This is for the family. For the family." As if he had done something noble, something right. At that moment, I collapsed to the floor, not feeling my legs. My body was as if made of stone. The tears that I had held inside finally burst out, but I cried silently. Something inside me broke forever. Shame, horror, disgust with myself. All this overwhelmed me. I just sat there, clutching my head, feeling the weight of that moment pressing down on me. I couldn't tell Andrew. I couldn't even allow myself to think about it. The fear that our marriage would collapse, that I would be condemned, was stronger than me. I chose silence because I didn't know what else to do. But with each passing day, this secret weighed on me more and more. A few weeks passed after that night, and my life changed forever. On the outside, everything seemed the same. Andrew and I lived as usual, went to work, had dinner with his parents as if nothing had happened. But inside me, a black hole was growing. Fear and shame became my constant companions, and I no longer felt like my old self. Every day I woke up with a heavy heart, and this heaviness didn't leave me for a minute. I tried to live as before, but even the simplest things became unbearable. Every time I saw my father-in-law, panic gripped me. His presence made my heart beat faster with horror. I felt him staring at me at the dinner table, his cold gaze piercing me to the bone. Every time our eyes met, I remembered that night, and my body froze again. Just like then, at the sink. I couldn't eat. I couldn't talk calmly. I was afraid to even look in his direction. Andrew noticed nothing. His world was completely consumed by work and the stress that had now become the norm in our home. He was depressed by our failed attempts to conceive, and this distanced us even more. We barely talked, and every night became torturous. I lay in bed next to him, feeling an enormous chasm between us, but I didn't dare tell him the truth. I was afraid that he wouldn't understand, wouldn't believe, or worse, would blame me for what had happened. With each passing day, I became more and more convinced that I had to remain silent. Silence became my salvation and my curse at the same time. I tried to convince myself that this was for the best, better for Andrew, better for our family, better for me. But this silence was suffocating me. I couldn't cope with the burden that was pulling me down. I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, feeling my father-in-law's touch, his breath on my skin. It was like a terrible dream that I couldn't wake up from. One day, when Andrew was again late at work, I sat at home alone and wondered, what next? Can I continue to live with this secret? With this pain? Deep down, I knew I couldn't. But to tell the truth meant destroying everything. I was afraid that the truth would shatter our marriage, ruin Andrew's life, and our family would fall apart. I was afraid to be the one who would destroy everything we had built for so long. Meanwhile, my father-in-law continued to find ways to be alone with me. Every time his wife went to her classes or left for errands, he found an excuse to come to our house. It was like a game I couldn't escape. I tried to avoid him, to hide, but every time he found me, and every time it was torture, as if I was reliving that first night again. I couldn't resist. I felt that something inside me had broken completely, and this broken part of me simply couldn't fight anymore. Another moment happened a few months after the first encounter. One evening, when I was sitting at home alone, he came again. This time I didn't fight. I knew it was useless. He entered the room, sat down next to me, and I felt everything inside me freeze. I didn't feel anything, neither fear, nor pain, nor horror. Only emptiness. He repeated his actions, violated my boundaries again, but I no longer resisted. My body no longer reacted as it had before, as if I had turned off my feelings to survive this. After it was all over, I sat alone in the room for a long time, trying to understand what was happening to me. I felt fear and pain consuming me. This had become a routine, something I couldn't change anymore. I began to feel that I deserved this, that I was to blame for allowing it to happen. I hated myself for not being able to fight, for continuing to be silent. But despite everything, I knew I couldn't tell Andrew. A year later, I became pregnant. It was a strange feeling, both relief and horror. This was the child that Andrew's family had been waiting for so long. This was supposed to bring joy to everyone. But I knew the truth. I knew whose child it was. And this truth tore me apart. I couldn't look at Andrew, couldn't talk to him about it. He was happy, but I felt our marriage cracking under the weight of my secret. After the birth of our son, the tension between me and Andrew grew even more. I saw how he cared for the child, how he laughed and played with him, and it caused me unbearable pain. I couldn't tell him the truth. It would destroy him. But every time I looked at my son, I felt the guilt growing inside me. My life had turned into constant torment. I couldn't live with this anymore, but I couldn't confess either. My silence became my jailer. Every day I woke up with the feeling that I didn't deserve this life, that I had betrayed my husband, my family, myself. I couldn't bear this pressure anymore. But how could I tell Andrew? How could I destroy everything we had? I stood on the brink, not knowing what to do next. Every night I woke up with the same thought: tell him or remain silent. Continue living in this nightmare or risk everything for the truth. I still don't know how to find a way out of this labyrinth. Secrets consume me, and silence becomes too heavy a burden.